Hello, hello, hello. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'd like to welcome you to Healing Outside the Box. I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach, and today I'm bringing you episode 252, and I'm calling it, Is GMO Food Ever a Good Thing? There is just too much information here for one quick episode, and no matter how long I flap my gums for, I will only scratch the surface. So I'll break this into 2 episodes and still only scratch the surface, but I'll give you some links if you'd like to go out and read more yourself. Today I'm going to talk about the potential minefield of ethical information about GMO foods. And then next week, I'll get into what Monsanto and other similar agribusinesses have been up to. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I begin. I am putting together an ebook with the working title, My Favorite Meatless Recipes. So if you'd like to get on board and get a free copy, just go to my website, Healing Outside the Box, and click Contact at the top. Then just leave me your email and I'll send you the recipe ebook when I'm done. The second thing I want to announce is that GMO labeling is now the law of the land. Whoopee! Whoopee! Whoop whoop! Hooray! Right now it's voluntary, but starting on January 1st of next year, 2022, it will be mandatory for food makers to label their food as genetically engineered or genetically modified. It's basically the same thing. There will be a symbol that you'll be able to recognize on the label. And speaking of GMO labeling laws, here is my little story about the Massachusetts State House public hearing on GMO labeling. The hearing was held on September 2015. The bill to label GMOs was agreed upon, voted in favorably, and sent to the Ways and Means Committee the following April, which was 2016. And then something happened on the political front in 2016. What was that? Oh yes, Monsanto sued the state of Vermont. Yes, they did. Days before Vermont tried to enact their GMO labeling law in their state. Then in November, Trump got elected and met with the CEO of Monsanto 3 days before his inauguration. I don't normally envy flies, but boy would I like to be a fly on the wall. And then poof, GMO labeling died on the vine and was declared illegal in all 50 states to vote it in. But I am happy to say that was not the end of the story. So I know about this public hearing in Massachusetts back in 2015 because I was there and gave a short talk to the Massachusetts House Committee considering the new GMO labeling bill, along with about 100 other people. I went with my PCA, or personal care attendant, to the State House that day to put my 2 cents into the record. When we arrived, we were escorted to the back door of the State House because I'm in a power wheelchair, and the seemingly thousands of steps in the front wasn't going to do it. So I wheeled in, and we took the elevator to the lobby. I had typed up my little 2-minute presentation, and I was ready to roll in and give it my all. I was all tingly with excitement because I love me some U.S. history. This Massachusetts State House was actually finished in 1798, and it replaced the old Massachusetts State House, where the Declaration of Independence was recited to the crowds in mid-July 1776. This newer State House from 1798 is a huge, magnificent old building with high ceilings and 200-year-old portraits adorning the walls. My PCA and I were escorted to the public hearing room, which looked more like an old movie theater than the public hearing rooms you see at the Capitol. There was a wider aisle at the top level where I wheeled myself in and waited in line with the other people who were also giving their 2-minute talks. Many of them were activists, and others wanted to say how important GMO labeling would be to themselves and their families. My job was to talk about the important science information that we had at that point, suggesting that Roundup-tolerant plants is not the same as Roundup-tolerant people. We already had studies coming in suggesting strongly that exposure to Roundup, either on the skin or inside us, can increase the risk of cancer. Monsanto was claiming at the time that Roundup had no effect on people, but the data shows otherwise. My background happens to be in nutrition biochemistry, and my first job in the field actually was as a lab technician at the MIT Nutrition Pathology Labs. I had my own 360 laboratory rats, but I've since gone into the clinical end of things. So I had my nose in journal articles about what possibly can and cannot cause cancer. Now, I would like to think that that's why the room fell quiet when I started talking, but it also, I know, has a little to do with the fact that I'm in a power wheelchair, and they were sitting up to see if I would lose control of my speed going down that steep ramp to the table with a microphone and perhaps crashing into the table, which I almost did, of course. My PCA at the time, who seemed distracted but otherwise was really good to have there, had to turn the pages and help me with my hand and so forth. But she did a great job. I noticed when we were waiting to come home that she seemed really anxious and excused herself to go to the bathroom a few times. I was oblivious to what was going on because I was so nervous about my own presentation. On the way home, she started leaning forward, and it looked like she was breaking out into a sweat. She wasn't driving, thank God, but she asked if the person driving could pull over and let her out in the middle of the street. He wasn't going to do it, thank God, but she looked sicker and sicker all the way home. Almost before the chair car stopped, she ran out the door, taking my keys with her, and up into my apartment while I was still in the car. I was getting a sinking feeling of what was happening. When she came out 10 minutes later to help me out of the car, she was noticeably relieved and wasn't sweating anymore. When I got into the bathroom after my long trip, I looked down on the floor and, sure enough, there were drops of blood on the floor. After the day that we went to the State House, I started to get suspicious and put a memory card in my surveillance camera of my front door. I was wondering if she had been leaving to buy drugs and come back. Sure enough, in the middle of the night, a few times, the front door opened. 10 minutes later, she came back in. She sat down at the kitchen table, which I can see from the front door camera, took off her shoes and socks. Then she went and got a teaspoon of mine from the silverware drawer and sat down again. Then I saw the flicker of a flame as she was lighting up the heroin to melt it, and not surprisingly at that point, filled the syringe and injected herself between her toes. She had taken the heroin with her to the Massachusetts State House with me. You're probably wondering why I didn't notice it when I hired her, but she was actually clean and sober for about a year. It broke my heart, but I had to let her go after that. Tragically, she didn't make it. She passed away a few years ago, so I have bittersweet memories of that day. Looking back on that time, I can understand that there has been a lot of confusion about whether these GMO plants are good or bad. Here's the deal. Genetically modifying an organism is neither good nor bad. The question to ask is this: why is it being modified? For example, scientists use genetically modified DNA from roses to make beautiful multicolored roses and purple roses that do not naturally show up in nature. Our life-saving vaccines are now being produced with genetic engineering. In terms of plants that are food, we are now able to transfer genes from a plant that can then withstand desert conditions, maybe a cactus, to a plant that perhaps can grow food in the Middle East, where months can go by without decent rainfall. We can genetically modify the DNA within a seed to grow edible plants with a stronger stalk that will withstand storms. I think most of us would agree that engineering a plant to withstand natural disasters is generally a good thing if you want to feed 8 or 9 billion people. And I doubt we would get protests in the street if we only engineer plants to have a higher protein content. But here's where the moral dilemma kicks in. Should we allow Monsanto to genetically engineer seeds from many different crops, then patent those seeds, engineer them only to produce one crop and never to be used again for the next generation, then sell the seeds at high prices to poor farmers who then cannot buy the seeds elsewhere? Should we allow a corporation like Monsanto to genetically engineer edible plants to withstand spraying with potentially toxic herbicides and pesticides? This, of course, is what they've been doing for decades. But should we continue to allow it? And once these agents have been found to cause cancer in people, should we really continue to allow the spraying of Roundup or its Agent Orange-like cousin, dicamba? I think most of us would say no to that. There was a recent article in Nature that has as its title, "Where Should We Draw the Line?" I believe that this conversation is long overdue. I'm not saying here that we cannot go back to the good old days where crops and livestock were farmed together, because I believe we can do anything if we put our time, effort, and passion into it. By the way, there's a great documentary out there called The Biggest Little Farm, and it's now playing on Netflix. Yay! I strongly recommend you give it a look if you're interested in how it can still be done. Again, it's called The Biggest Little Farm, and it's on Netflix. Ultimately, I believe we can be guided by our moral compass. Sorry, I love a good cliche. And take the best of both worlds. In other words, we can use the ethical ways to genetically modify edible plants and use ethical ways to raise farm animals. And for God's sakes, feed those animals what they're supposed to be eating. Let them roam around in the fields. Okay, so how do we decide what's ethical and what's not ethical, and who decides that? Well, that should be the easy part. Let's let the scientists figure that out. There are certain changes that are for the best, and probably will be inevitable. For example, robots may do more precision farming. This means that we could use robots to add nutrients to the soil, or drones that could spray healthy fertilizers to the soil without infecting the lungs of farmers. If robots are used to harvest produce, they can harvest vegetables and fruits closer to the ripening stage, so that more nutrients and flavor compounds are allowed to form in the product. And this also avoids breaking the backs of immigrant farm workers, picking up watermelons and squashes off the ground by hand. We could utilize things like vertical farming, especially in urban areas, or we could infuse water droplets full of nutrients in the air that would allow plants to grow with no chemical fertilizers. After all, we are the species with the big forebrains. We can work this out as long as we are willing to regulate the bad guys from doing bad things. And don't worry, I will get to Monsanto in my next episode. But first, let's pull apart this article from Nature. I'll put the link in the show notes. They start out by saying that we already have the technology to infuse genes from one species into another completely different species. You might be thinking to yourself, what about rejection? Like what happens with organ transplants? Actually, because we are transferring only genes, rejection doesn't happen. Crops have been engineered to become sturdier, and that's a good thing. But fish and animals have also been engineered to grow larger and faster, as is the case with salmon. But if we're injecting human growth hormone, could that have unexpected consequences? The jury's still out. And cows have been genetically engineered for resistance to mad cow disease, after we apparently managed to give them mad cow disease, that is. Okay, so why is the name Monsanto associated with GMO foods in a bad way? It is because Monsanto used genetically modified organisms in evil ways. They maximized their own profits and hurt or destroyed smaller farmers in the process. They actually sued Vermont and won. They sued India too, by the way. There basically are two reasons why corporations like Monsanto use GMO products. The first is herbicide resistance. Now, the aerial spraying of herbicides was first made famous when Agent Orange was sprayed onto the jungles in Vietnam. This herbicide killed jungle plants, but also killed crops like rice and gave people cancer. So agribusinesses like Monsanto started using Roundup as a weed killer and eventually went large scale. They would like to spray it onto crops, the problem obviously being that an herbicide will kill the crops. So before they could do that, they had to genetically modify the crop to withstand spraying with a lethal herbicide. Here's what they did. They isolated an enzyme from bacteria that can withstand glyphosate because it inactivates it. Then they added this enzyme to soybean seeds. This allowed the soybeans to be sprayed with Roundup without dying. Monsanto quickly patented their seeds and then forced farmers to buy their seeds every year. They also had to buy Roundup and not another brand of herbicide. Monsanto then genetically modified seeds from almost every other crop and did the same with those seeds. They made the seeds sterile, essentially, so you could not use the corn kernels to grow another batch of corn the next year. Monsanto then sued farmers that did not cooperate with their rules and drove farmers out of business who did not agree to buy Monsanto seeds. The second reason is insect resistance. We now know that there is a natural substance in organisms like bacteria that can fight off potential enemies. A bacteria in the Bacillus family contains a protein that is a natural insecticide. This protein is inserted in the genetically modified corn seed to help the corn resist attack by insects. So plants can now be modified with a protein inserted into the seeds that would protect the plant from a virus and perhaps someday a fungus. That in itself is not a bad thing. So let's move on. The third and also troubling reason is the alteration in fatty acid composition. This has happened with canola oil. Canola oil comes from the seed of a mustard-like plant. This seed is called rapeseed, and it's naturally high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. When I first heard the term rapeseed, I thought that the person was saying grapeseed oil. Wow, that's interesting, I thought to myself. That should be a healthy oil. But then I realized that fruit really doesn't have any fat. Then I realized it was rapeseed oil, and I thought to myself, oh, they might need a better name for that. And alas, canola is the name that I could recommend to everybody, since it was high in polyunsaturated fats. Until canola oil got genetically modified to make it higher in saturated fat. The reason is to increase the shelf life of, say, snack foods, which will then increase profits for the company making the foods. They modified the canola oil to add more laurate or lauric acid. This is a saturated fatty acid normally found in palm oil, and it will make the canola oil stable or not go rancid for longer periods of time. And I think we all know that saturated fat will raise our LDL cholesterol fraction, which can contribute to the plaque on our arteries. So not so good there. There's a basic article in the Journal of Nutrition where they are evaluating adding minerals like iron and zinc to low nutrient staples, such as rice. I'll leave a link in the show notes for that. They call this process breeding, but it is really genetic engineering as well. If they can add iron to rice, they can certainly add vitamin A to rice as well, and that's a good thing. The problem, potentially, and I can't stress this enough, is that Monsanto, if they get their grubby little hands on these seeds, will patent it and then force farmers to buy their seeds every year. So farmers in developing countries won't be able to use those same seeds for the next year's crop. That is a huge problem for many reasons, not the least of which is that Monsanto is only motivated by profit and not the desire to give nutrient-rich foods to the masses in developing countries. Countries that in the future might be suffering drought due to climate change or starvation due to civil war. So, are GMO foods good or bad? The answer is this. It depends on why it is being modified and who is doing the modifying. If you're thinking right now, gee whiz, Gene, haven't we got enough problems? And don't we have enough food in this country? And why should we even bother thinking about this? Okay, true enough. But you might want to gnaw on this piece of information I just found on the internet. And yes, I know, don't believe everything you hear on the internet. Okay, but I promise to look into this source in greater detail and find other sources with more information on this for next week. Here it is. Scientists have now been able to genetically engineer a different skin color on the offspring of a fish. That pretty much makes my head explode. But for now, I'm going to pretend that I never just said that and wish you all a safe and relaxing week. And as Crosby, Stills, and Nash once said, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. I don't know if that's evergreen advice. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.